Everyone loves a loudmouth until the room goes dead silent. When a 26-year-old hotshot instructor decided to humiliate a 12-year-old boy in front of a packed Austin dojo, he didn't realize the kid's quiet, unassuming father had survived 2 tours in Fallujah. What happened next took exactly one punch. David Callahan was not a man who went looking for trouble. In fact, for the better part of the last decade, he had made a conscious daily effort to avoid it. At 42 years old, David was a man who appreciated the quiet mundanity of civilian life. He liked waking up at 5 in the morning to brew a pot of black coffee. He enjoyed his job managing a logistics warehouse on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. And above all, he lived for his son, Leo. But David was also a man who carried a past. Underneath his standard uniform of faded Levi's, scuffed Red Wing boots, and loose-fitting flannel shirts, he held the muscle memory and the psychological scars of a Force Recon Marine who had seen the absolute worst of human nature in the sun-baked streets of Fallujah. He had spent his 20s surviving in environments where a split-second hesitation meant a folded flag presented to a grieving mother. When he came home, he locked that part of himself away in a very dark, very secure mental vault. He didn't brag about his service. He didn't wear baseball caps plastered with military insignias. He just wanted to be a dad. The problem was that the world doesn't always let you be just a dad. 12-year-old Leo was a gentle kid. He liked graphic novels, coding simple video games, and rescuing stray cats. He did not like confrontation. Unfortunately, his quiet demeanor had made him a prime target for a group of aggressive 8th graders at O. Henry Middle School. After Leo came home with a bruised cheek and a torn backpack for the 3rd time in a month, David knew he had to intervene. He had spoken to the principal, he'd spoken to the teachers, but the bureaucracy of the school system was a slow-moving machine. Leo needed to learn how to stand his ground, not just physically, but mentally. He needed confidence. That was how David and Leo ended up at Higgins Elite Mixed Martial Arts. Located in a bustling strip mall off North Lamar Boulevard, the gym was impossible to miss. It boasted massive neon signs, frosted windows plastered with aggressive tribal graphics, and a towering decal of the owner, Chad Higgins, mid-kick, glaring menacingly at the traffic. Chad Higgins was 26, built like a Greek statue, and possessed an ego that barely fit through the double glass doors of his own establishment. He was a 2nd-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, had a smattering of amateur kickboxing trophies lining his front desk, and treated his gym less like a place of discipline and more like a personal kingdom where he was the reigning monarch. From the very first day, David's instincts, honed by years of threat assessment, prickled. As he sat on the aluminum bleachers along the back wall nursing a lukewarm coffee in a paper cup, he watched Chad run the youth class. The environment wasn't about building kids up. It was about tearing them down so Chad could look like a savior. The loud hip-hop music echoing off the high tin ceiling. The smell of industrial cleaner masking the scent of stale sweat. The neon green training mats. It all felt performative. "Push it! What is this, a tea party?" Chad had barked, pacing the mats in tight compression shorts and a custom rash guard that hugged his heavily tattooed biceps. "If you can't give me 20 burpees without crying, you're going to get eaten alive out there. The streets don't care about your feelings." David shifted uncomfortably on the bleachers. The streets, he thought. This is a suburban strip mall in Austin, not a war zone. Beside David sat Mike Torres, another father whose daughter was in the class. Mike leaned over, keeping his voice low. "Intense guy, huh? My wife thinks he's a bit much. But I figure these days kids need a little tough love. Toughens them up." "There's a difference between being tough and being a bully," David replied quietly, his eyes never leaving Leo. Leo was struggling. He was a slender kid, out of breath, his oversized GI slipping off his shoulder. Every time Leo stumbled, Chad would single him out, using him as a punchline to entertain the assistant instructors, a pair of nodding sycophants named Todd and Jared. "Look at Callahan," Chad sneered, pointing a taped finger at Leo. "Legs like wet noodles." "Come on, kid. My grandma hits the mat harder than you, and she's been dead for 10 years. A few of the other kids giggled. Leo flushed crimson, dropping his head, his shoulders slumping. David's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched in his cheek. He took a slow, deep breath, visualizing the anger as a tangible thing, boxing it up and pushing it to the back of his mind. "Patience," he told himself. "Let the kid learn to face adversity." He was trying to give Chad the benefit of the doubt. Martial arts required discipline, and sometimes coaches had a rough exterior. But as the weeks progressed, the tough love began to look a lot like targeted harassment. Chad seemed to harbor a specific disdain for Leo. It wasn't just because Leo was unathletic. It was because Leo didn't worship Chad the way the other kids did. Leo was quiet, observational, and clearly uncomfortable with the hyper-masculine bravado Chad demanded. To a narcissist like Chad, that lack of adoration was an insult. It all came to a head on a sweltering Tuesday evening in late August. The Texas heat was baking the asphalt outside, and the air conditioning inside the gym was struggling to keep up. The class was packed. There were about 30 kids on the mat, and the bleachers were filled with parents glued to their smartphones, occasionally glancing up to snap a photo for Instagram. David was sitting in his usual spot, arms crossed over his faded gray Henley shirt, watching intently. Chad clapped his hands loudly, the sharp smack echoing through the humid room. "All right, listen up. Today we're working on close quarters defense. What happens when someone bigger than you crowds your space? What happens when some punk tries to grab your collar?" Chad paced like a caged tiger, chest puffed out. He loved an audience. You don't back down. You dominate the space. You make them regret touching you. I need a dummy to demonstrate. His eyes swept over the nervous faces of the children. They intentionally avoided his gaze. Chad's demonstrations were notoriously painful. He didn't know how to pull his punches or ease up on his submissions when working with beginners. Chad's eyes locked onto Leo, who was standing quietly in the second row, staring at his bare feet. "Callahan," Chad barked. "Front and center." David's posture straightened on the bleachers. He leaned forward, planting his boots firmly on the aluminum flooring. Every protective instinct in his body fired at once, a silent alarm ringing in his ears. Leo hesitated, looking back toward the bleachers. David gave him a small, reassuring nod, though inside, his stomach was tying itself into knots. Leo swallowed hard and shuffled to the center of the bright green mat, looking incredibly small next to the imposing figure of the instructor. "All right, everyone pay attention to this," Chad announced, grabbing Leo by the lapels of his white gi. He yanked the boy forward roughly, causing Leo to stumble and lose his footing. "Now, Callahan here represents your typical victim. No balance, no spatial awareness. If I'm a street thug, he's already my property." A few of the assistant instructors snickered from the sidelines. The parents on the bleachers went quiet, a few shifting uncomfortably, but no one said a word. In this room, Chad was the undisputed authority. "Now, Leo, I want you to grab my shoulder, like you're going to push me," Chad instructed, his tone dripping with condescension. Leo reached out with a trembling hand and lightly gripped the fabric of Chad's rash guard. "Harder, kid. Are you petting a dog or trying to fight?" Chad snapped. Leo gripped harder, bracing himself. "Now," Chad addressed the class, his voice booming. "When the aggressor makes contact, you don't step back. You step in. You pivot. You break their base, and you take them to the ground hard. Watch my hips." What happened next was supposed to be a standard osodogari, a major outer reaping throw. In a controlled environment, especially with a 12-year-old beginner, the instructor is supposed to guide the student to the mat, supporting their weight so they can practice their breakfall. Chad did not do that. Whether he wanted to show off for a passing group of high school girls outside the window, or whether he simply wanted to exert his dominance, Chad threw the move with the violent intensity of a tournament finale. He stepped in, slammed his forearm across Leo's chest, hooked his leg behind the boy's knees, and reaped with vicious force. Leo's feet flew out from under him. He was completely airborne for a fraction of a second before gravity and Chad's momentum violently introduced him to the floor. Because Chad hadn't supported him, and because Leo hadn't yet mastered the breakfall, the boy hit the mat awkwardly. Smack! The sound of Leo's shoulder and ribs hitting the dense foam was sickeningly loud. But worse was the sound that followed. A sharp, gasping wheeze as all the air was violently forced from the boy's lungs. Leo lay flat on his back, eyes wide with panic, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he desperately tried to draw breath. Tears of shock and pain sprang instantly to his eyes. He curled into a fetal position, clutching his ribs, letting out a high-pitched, choked whimper. The gym went dead silent. The hip-hop music seemed inappropriately loud in the sudden vacuum of human noise. On the bleachers, the paper coffee cup in David's hand crumpled. Hot liquid spilled over his knuckles, but he didn't feel it. The mental vault where he kept the Marine, the warrior, the man who survived house-to-house combat in Al-Anbar province, suddenly cracked open. "Oops," Chad said, barely concealing a smirk as he looked down at the writhing child. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't kneel to check the boy's breathing. Instead, he turned to the class. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you learn to fall. Pain is just weakness leaving the body. Get up, Callahan. Stop crying. You're embarrassing yourself. Leo couldn't get up. He was paralyzed by the spasm in his diaphragm, sobbing silently. "I said get up," Chad demanded, stepping closer, nudging Leo's leg with his toe. "This is a martial arts dojo, not a daycare. You want to act like a little girl? Go take ballet." Before Chad could say another word, a shadow fell over the mat. David hadn't run. He hadn't yelled. He had simply stood up, bypassed the little swinging gate that separated the spectator area from the training floor, and walked straight onto the mat with his boots still on. A cardinal sin in any dojo. His face was an emotionless mask carved from stone. His eyes, however, were entirely dead. It was the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen bodies stacked like cordwood, focused entirely on the arrogant 26-year-old in front of him. "Hey, no shoes on the mat!" Todd, one of the assistant instructors, yelled, stepping forward to intercept David. David didn't even break his stride. As Todd reached out to grab his arm, David simply shifted his shoulders, executing a microscopic parry that deflected Todd's hand and sent the younger man stumbling past him, completely off balance. David didn't even look at him. He reached his son. David dropped to one knee, completely ignoring Chad. His massive, calloused hands that had gripped M4 rifles and dragged wounded men through the dirt, gently cupped the back of Leo's neck. "Breathe with me, buddy," David said, his voice a low, soothing rumble, completely at odds with the tension in the room. "In through the nose, out through the mouth. You just got the wind knocked out of you. You're okay. Ribs are intact. Just breathe." It took an agonizing 30 seconds, but Leo finally managed to draw a ragged, hitching breath. The color began to return to his pale face. He buried his face in his father's flannel shirt, crying quietly. "I got you," David whispered, lifting the boy to his feet with effortless strength. He kept one arm securely around his son's shoulders. "Go get your gym bag from the cubby, Leo. We're going home." Leo nodded, wiping his nose, and limped off the mat toward the locker area. David watched him go, making sure he was safe. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned to face Chad Higgins. Chad was fuming. His authority had been undermined in front of his entire class. His face was flushed red beneath his tribal tattoos. He puffed his chest out, stepping into David's personal space, trying to use his height advantage. He was 2 inches taller than David and arguably 20 pounds heavier, all sculpted gym muscle. "Who do you think you are walking onto my mat with your dirty boots?" Chad hissed, loud enough for the parents to hear. You're lucky I don't charge you for a deep clean. And if you're pulling your kid out because he got a little bump, you're raising a coward." David stood perfectly still. His hands hung loosely at his sides. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't raise his voice. When he spoke, it was with the chilling, flat cadence of a man stating the weather. "You're not teaching these kids discipline," David said, his voice carrying easily across the silent gym. "You're feeding your own ego. You used excessive force on a beginner because you knew he couldn't fight back. That doesn't make you a martial artist. That makes you a coward." The collective gasp from the bleachers was audible. Sarah Jenkins, the gym's receptionist, had stopped typing at her computer desk by the front door. Mike Torres was staring, mouth slightly agape. No one spoke to Chad Higgins like that. Chad's eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. The vein in his forehead pulsed. "Excuse me? Old man, you have no idea who you're talking to. I'm a competitive fighter. I could fold you into a pretzel in front of your kid before you even realized what happened." "I have no doubt you believe that," David said calmly. He didn't step back. He held Chad's gaze with such an unnerving intensity that for a fraction of a second, Chad actually broke eye contact. "But you're not going to touch me, and you're never going to speak to my son again." David turned his back on Chad and began walking toward the exit. In the world of toxic masculinity, turning your back on an aggressor is the ultimate dismissal. It told Chad that David didn't view him as a threat. It shattered Chad's fragile ego into a million jagged pieces. "Hey!" Chad yelled, his voice cracking with rage. "You think you can just walk in here, disrespect my dojo, insult me, and walk away? That's what you're teaching your kid? How to run away like a little bitch?" David stopped. He closed his eyes for a brief second. He thought about the peace he had cultivated. He thought about the VA therapist who told him to count to 10 when triggered. He counted to 3. It wasn't enough. David turned around. The atmosphere in the gym had fundamentally shifted. The oppressive humidity suddenly felt cold. The parents on the bleachers were no longer looking at their phones. They were leaning forward, gripped by a primal sense of impending violence. "I'm not running," David said, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm removing my son from a toxic environment. There's nothing left to discuss." "Oh, there's plenty to discuss," Chad snarled, marching forward until he was standing just inches from David. The smell of Chad's aggressive cologne and sweat washed over David. "You talk a big game for a fat old man in a flannel shirt. You think I'm a coward? Prove it. Step on the mat. Let's see what you've got." David looked at the young man. He saw the puffed chest, the flared nostrils, the desperate need for validation. "I don't fight for sport," David said simply. "And I don't fight to prove anything to children." "You're scared," Chad mocked, turning to the crowd, arms raised in a theatrical shrug. "Look at him. Big, tough dad, completely terrified. It's easy to run your mouth when you know you can just hide behind the threat of a lawsuit. That's why you won't fight. You know I'll break your jaw, and then you'll run crying to a lawyer." David sighed. It was a heavy, weary sound. "I have no interest in suing you. I just want to leave." Chad snapped his fingers at the front desk. "Sarah, print out the sparring waiver, the unconditional one." Sarah, the young receptionist, looked terrified. "Chad, I don't think—" "Do it!" he roared. Sarah frantically clicked her mouse, the printer whirring to life a moment later. Chad marched over, snatched the single sheet of paper from the tray, grabbed a pen, and stalked back to David. He slapped the paper against the receptionist's countertop. "Here," Chad breathed heavily, a manic glint in his eyes. "This is an ironclad legal waiver. It states that 2 consenting adults agree to a full-contact sparring match on these premises. No rules, submission, or knockout. It waives all liability. You sign this, you can't sue me, you can't call the cops, and you can't cry to the judge when you wake up in the hospital. It means what happens on that mat stays on that mat." Chad shoved the pen toward David's chest. "So put your money where your mouth is, or grab your kid and waddle out of here so we can all get back to training real men." David looked at the pen. Then he looked at Leo, who was standing by the cubbies clutching his gym bag, watching with wide, fearful eyes. David didn't want this. He hated violence. He had spent years trying to wash the blood off his hands, trying to forget the sound a man makes when his lungs fill with fluid. He had sworn to himself he would never use his training against a civilian. But as he looked at Chad Higgins, he realized something. Chad wasn't just a bully. He was a predator. Today, it was Leo. Tomorrow, it would be another kid. Chad used martial arts as a shield to legally assault people who couldn't defend themselves, hiding behind the guise of training. Someone needed to teach Chad the lesson he was so desperate to impart on others, that there's always someone bigger, faster, and more dangerous out there. "Dad?" Leo called out, his voice trembling. "Let's just go." David looked at his son. He offered a gentle, reassuring smile. "It's okay, Leo. Just give me 2 minutes. Sit right there." David turned back to the counter. He took the pen from Chad's hand. He didn't rush. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, slipped them on, and read the waiver thoroughly. He read every single clause. The gym was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Is this legally binding?" David asked, his voice calm, looking at Sarah, the receptionist. Sarah swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Yes, sir. We use it for the professional fighters when they come in for hard sparring. It waives all rights to civil and criminal prosecution in the event of injury." "Excellent," David murmured. He signed his name at the bottom, David Callahan. He wrote the date. He laid the pen down with a soft click. Chad grinned. It was an ugly, feral thing. "All right, go grab some gloves from the bin. We'll go 3 5-minute rounds, MMA rules." "I don't need gloves," David said. He took off his reading glasses and tucked them safely away. He reached down and slowly unlaced his heavy Red Wing boots. He placed them neatly against the wall. He pulled off his thick wool socks, folding them and placing them inside the boots. Then David grabbed the hem of his faded flannel shirt and pulled it over his head, a collect.